Alright, so I'm going to just go ahead and do a review of all of the research that I did for the Traffic Cop project, as if I was just some YouTube news commentator. So, to start with, this is largely just a Quest 2 shill, but that's neither here nor there. It's kind of interesting due to the fact that the user that posted this has since had his account suspended. So, keeping that in mind, there's a lot of arguments over why you should buy a Quest 2 instead of an HTC Vive of whichever model, the Vive Pro, the Cosmos Elite. I personally am using a Cosmos, which uses the wonderful joy of the quote inside out tracking, which means I don't need to set up base or tower stations to pick up my VR movements. I can just tether myself to the desktop and go from there. One of the most interesting things that I found during my research of the Quest 2, in order to get conformity with the specifications that the game needs to maintain in order to keep from bogging it down, is that the Quest 2 has roughly 400 points less in the single thread performance than an Intel i5 7500, and half of the performance thereabout of the multi-core performance of an i5. So we're not dealing with a heavyweight lifting device to begin with. And then we go here to the benchmark. And as we can see, the various different potentials. Oh, this is just covering the Cosmos. So the Cosmos is what I'm using. And we can see that it's able to tackle most every one of the... And this one down here is almost identical to my build. And it's able to tackle all the renders at more than 100% quality. So my system won't necessarily be the most ideal to test the final build of the game on, because it's not the ideal target platform. And you see here the article that was showing me the differences between outside tracking and inside out tracking. The Cosmos that I uses inside out tracking. And then here's the Trello board. So here on the Trello board, you can see all of the various items that were listed for programming, and all of the various sets of the documentation that we needed for that. So right now I'm going to go over the various basic structures of Traffic Cop, what are the core gameplay mechanics of it, and I'm going to talk more than a little bit briefly about what programming tasks need to be done after I go over each of the mechanics of it. So the central mechanics of Traffic Cop is using hand gestures and the buttons on the VR controllers. The players will direct traffic towards their desired points in opposing lanes. The failure to direct traffic in an expedient enough fashion will cause them to rush across the lanes without direction, possibly leading to collisions. Drivers that cross will sometimes throw things to the traffic officer, and there are a couple of mini-games that break up the flow of gameplay. So the mini-games are the alien shooting and the duck slingshot, and that's the majority of what the mini-games are. The mini-games occur between certain levels, and they serve as a different style of gameplay aside from being a traffic director. So using the hand gestures and the buttons on the VR, so what we're going to need for that is it's going to have to do a raycast from where the controller is pointing and to a specifically pre-described position. So what it's going to be doing is it's going to be aiming to hit an invisible spear or an invisible sphere that is going to check to see when a raycast hits it, and then it will register that the traffic cop is pointing at that particular one. So to start with, you get a car from one lane and you point it to, hopefully, its desired lane, and then it proceeds to cross the street. Um, in action, this is a somewhat smooth mechanic. There's a game called Traffic Jams, which just has you doing hand gestures of the stop, the go faster, and then using the other hand as your pointer, as your designated pointer. Okay, you stop. Okay, you go faster. But with Traffic Cop, you point at one lane, and then you point at the destination, and it moves from A to B. And the way this is working right now is that when you're hovered over the sphere, it's blue when you're pointing at it, and when you select it, it turns green. And that's the visual cue that Traffic Cop currently uses in order to help the user determine which lane that they're pointing at. The failure to direct the traffic in an expedient enough fashion is a countdown timer that is on the object. I'm not going to say that any of the vehicles or any of the pedestrians are actually physics objects. It does not look like they're physics objects. It looks like they are static, non-physics physics objects that just move through the lane. The way they despawn when an event happens, like a collision or when they're shot, is they begin scaling down and then they just disappear. They don't bounce around. They don't ricochet. They don't collide and impart inertia. They just bang into one another. There's a fiery explosion sound played. There's a bit of particle effects, and then they shrink. And it registers on the board as a collision. Drivers of that cross will sometimes throw things to the traffic officer. The things that are being thrown at the traffic officer are actually physics objects, and these can range from donuts, burgers, apple cores, and this typically occurs when the traffic is driving by the officer. The officer is actually able to catch these objects and even throw them back at cars that threw them at him. So that's an interesting layer to the gameplay. There are mini games in the larger game itself that occasionally occur between the levels. One of them is defense against the alien invasion. The other one is like a carnival shot at little moving duck targets. Those are just regular game mechanics. The aliens descend towards the traffic cop, who is given ray gun down a single street. The traffic cop is expected to use that ray gun to destroy the aliens and shoot and intercept the projectiles that the aliens shoot at the player. So the current game flow of Traffic Cop is that you have green lanes, your right lane, and you direct those green lanes into their desired destination, the red dots here. So you go from a green dot to a red dot. The yellow dot here is where the player stands. So the player is actually in the middle of 4 separate lanes of traffic, which means that the player has to keep their head on a swivel. One of the things that I would suggest with this is that I can understand if somebody has a wireless headset. The ability to look all around themselves while they're standing in a room is very easy, but for the folks that are using a wired headset, turning around to do the whole 360 look around is going to be a lot more cumbersome for the people who are wired to their desktop than it would be for somebody who's using a wireless headset. So perhaps for the sake of hitting a larger platform audience, removing one of the streets so that they're only looking at an 180 degree round instead of a 360 degree round would make life a lot easier. for the player and for development, because it would literally cut our task load by more than a quarter if there was only two possible choices of destination for every start instead of, you know, three. And I mean, theoretically, there could be U-turns, but I didn't see any U-turns in the first game. So that could possibly be an add-in if it was desired. The ability for the traffic cop to, instead of doing these far left turns, to instead turn this into a U-turn. So then each turn position would have three. So each position would then have three possible destinations, and we would keep the same number of possible destinations, but at the same time making it so that the player doesn't have to like spin around to see all the traffic. Okay. So the current game features: the carts explode, including sound when they crash. They're not physics objects as far as I can determine. When they run into one another, they stop moving, they spew fire and banging noises, and then they shrink out of existence. There are currently pedestrians in the game, but they don't cross the street, so they're not really an issue for the traffic cop. You can accidentally shoot him during the alien hunt minigame. But as far as they exist right now, they don't interact with traffic at all. Things being thrown at the player during events, so you really just have to calculate the distance from the source of the throw and the player, since this stuff travels on an arc. That can actually be done with some somewhat simple algebraic equations and a little bit of pseudophysics, because all you're trying to do is describe an arc between the two. If you really wanted to get messy about it, you could make it not a physics object and just impart it as XY delta separates instead of using real physics. So when I pitch my hand forward, I have the x coordinates that it's traveling along and I have the y direction that it's moving. So if I'm holding something in my hand by keeping the trigger depressed and then I release it, if we take an extrapolation of 3 points along the sample line and we average them out, we will get a non-derivative equation that we can use to break out the x and the y, or in this instance the x, y, and z, in order to determine what arc it should travel. And then we move it along one arc in one linear expression and another arc in the separate linear expression. So it moves along a line, and then it just moves up, and then how high it's going just moves up and down on the basis of a pseudogravity. So instead of making it a physics object and having the physics engine handle it, which can be very intensive overhead, we instead just use a simple code. And the main reason that we'd go with this approach is that if I need to determine how far something is away from me before I throw it, that's a single distance that we can just get with the 3D vectoring equation. And then we just take the x out of that 3D vectoring equation, or we take the vector out of that, we take the raw distance between it, and we know exactly how far the object has to travel. So then we just extrapolate a y parabola across that, which is fairly simple because it's just a expression of gravity versus distance, so or pseudo gravity versus distance. So we know how high it would have to travel up in order to reach the equal point in the parabola of the toss. So if the x needs to travel, say, 14 units, the y would need to it needs to travel 14 units in 2 seconds. We know that the y needs to travel at least a foot-ish up in order to get there at the end of 2 seconds. by going up a foot, then back down a foot. So it would describe the parabolic arc without having to use the actual game physics engine or making a game physics object, which the system should be able to handle. But when we start getting into multiple sets at this event, or when we start dealing with the slingshot, making every projectile that comes out of the slingshot a physics object might be a bit of a heavy overhead. But honestly, this is one of the things that we're going to have to test build for. Test the viability of using the projectiles as a physics object versus using the projectiles as a scripted object. The aliens in the minigame shoot at the player. That one is pretty simple. You just need to find the location of the player, and then you just need to propel a projectile along that vector at him. Done. The player doesn't even move, so that's a very easy one to compensate for. The ducks move in a very controlled and pre-existing path. The cars move in a very controlled and pre-existing path as well. Once you direct them to a point, they follow along a very fixed route in order to get to the end result of that point. The wheels need to not move when they're at rest, and the wheels need to turn when they're moving. And the car itself, if we can afford it graphically and system-wise, one of the things that would be nice to see in the update is the wheels in the front of the car actually turning during a turn rather than remaining fixed like they are currently in the game. Aliens and duck make a sound when hit by a projectile. So when the ray hits the aliens, it makes a choo-choo sound. When the slingshot bullet hits the ducks, it makes a ding sound. This is just the small stuff that really helps sell the game as being something immersive. Angry drivers have vocal barks and audio cues for when their cars when they decide to run the stop. So after a certain amount of time, the drivers waiting to be directed across the traffic become discontent with their wait, and they will speed across the intersection. This can lead to collisions, this can lead to problems, this can lead to all sorts of different fun stuff. So we just need to account for that again in the game. And use the barks we already have, make new barks, decide which one works best. The menu for the VR setup is circular around the player. The player navigates through it by using their VR sticks to point at the menu choice that they want. Currently, the UI draws a line out from the pointer in order to clearly show the player where they're pointing. There's nothing wrong with that. Some of the proposed content was going to be pedestrians will now cross the streets, becoming an additional task and hazards for the player. Minigames might be made into an unlocked sub-item rather than interrupting the flow of the job simulator gameplay. So one of the complaints that I noticed when I was reading through the reviews and the comments was that people didn't like the minigames being mandatory. They didn't like the fact that it would come right smack in the middle of the gameplay, and it would take them out of being a traffic cop to do a minigame where they just shoot at things. It really depends on what the product owner wants for that. One of the features that definitely needs to be added is the option to reduce or mute the music of the game, and to generally just change the volume of the game in general. It was not currently a feature of the previous build, but it definitely needs to be added into the game. There was the possibility of making the pedestrians a physics object so that when they get impacted, you can actually see consequence for failure, just like when the cars impact and explode. Imparting an inertia on the pedestrians will be easy. During the impact, we can actually swap out a given pedestrian for their ragdoll equivalent and despawn the pedestrian that was collided with while spawning in the ragdoll of that pedestrian and playing the sounds for it. So we can actually make it so that the physics object of the pedestrian doesn't exist until after the impact has occurred. So we don't have a bunch of physic object pedestrians walking up and down the street constantly. They'll just become an interactable, bouncy, ragdoll-y physics object after they've been hit. The particle effects will be altered to allow for use on a smaller platform of Quest 2. We'll take a very strong look at the asset requirements for particle production systems or various different just particle systems on Unreal and attempt to determine how much of them the system can afford based on the average of how many might be active at a single given time. And it's kind of important to remember this because we're aiming for the Quest 2, which has some of the lowest system specs of all the various VR headsets. Since it's kind of braggable that it doesn't have to be tethered to computer in order to work, but at the same time, because it's not tethered to computer, it doesn't have the full resources. So we were told the Quest 2 is going to be our target platform, so we program down to the Quest 2 and you make sure that the assets that we're developing are compatible with the Quest 2 since that's going to be our target release platform. The 3D assets will be kept in reasonable limits to prevent the Quest 2 from lagging or becoming overburdened by the game. Again, this deals largely with art assets, but for the programmer side, when it comes to optimization, we should avoid using physics objects when we can choose not to. We should avoid using some of the more robust systems of Unreal simply because they're there and they're easy to code. If push comes to shove, we definitely could just rely on the physics engine that's unshakably a part of the Unreal Engine rather than attempting to program our own little workarounds. But if we were going to do that, I would definitely prefer to put in a population cap so that we can't have more than X number of physics objects on the screen at once, because if we have more than X number of physics objects on the screen at once, that every one of them is going to be taking up resources, every one of them is going to be taking up processing power. So it might just be good as well that we bring back the old practice of population caps in order to prevent an excess of physics objects from spawning in the scene that would cause the Quest 2 to crash or have issues. This has been a summation of the research that I've been doing for the entirety of this past week. Thank you for your time.